Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So last week we talked about the price of progress and if a correlation existed, potentially existed in a societal decline with economic or technological prosperity. I feel like this week's topic has nothing to do with that one, so there's going to be kind of a delineation. So for those of you who are just jumping in now, this is a good one to do it on because there's really no continuity here. Today we're going to be talking about non-liability crimes and kind of the implications of a non-liability crime. And to preface this, we will state the legal definition as far as the United States is concerned, and more widely spread, I would suppose, about what a non-liability crime is. And then we're going to probably come up with more of a common definition and then go into that a little bit. Because essentially, sticking within a strict legal framework provides more opportunities for us to maybe make mistakes that, when exploited on a technical level, kind of throws out the rest of it. So as long as we stick to more of a principled stance, there's a lot more open to interpretation there. And then from the principles, you can extrapolate what that would mean in the technical sense. So all crimes that can be committed by a person against another person or against the state for which they can be tried. Okay, so all crimes fall into one of two camps: liability crimes and non-liability crimes. A non-liability crime is a crime for which you have to have intent in order to be held liable. So for example, if I were to run over your mailbox, right, on accident, if that were a non-liability crime, I'm not guilty of doing it, and I don't have
because you
to pay.
accidentally did it.
Right, I had no intention to, so I cannot be found guilty of the crime because I did not intend to.
The crime is legally defined as intentionally destroying someone's mailbox.
Exactly. Now, what's usually attached to this is no punishments sometimes, but usually there's no restitution required for a non-liability crime. There are exceptions. For example, the difference between, well, generally speaking, the difference between manslaughter and murder. Manslaughter typically describes when you end the life of another person inadvertently without intention, and it was like an accident. In those cases, you do not have to pay any restitution to the family of that person, and you usually, the sentencing is very minor because you didn't have intent. It was an accident, and there's this human understanding that we would all want to be held to the same standard if we were in that case. And if I really just didn't mean to do it, it was just a pure accident, I wouldn't want to be held to the same extent as someone who intentionally was trying to kill somebody, whether it be impulsively with intent, because that's one thing, or premeditated intent.
And from more of a principled place, one could think of it, it's not merely that I don't want to be held, at full liability for killing somebody when I didn't mean to, but also, if you consider what the purpose of punishment is in cases of murder, it's to dissuade murder, but you're not dissuading anything if it really was an honest mistake.
Exactly. I think it's called strict liability crimes as opposed to I think that's why I couldn't find it. So that was a misnomer on my part. But the general principle: an act plus intention is a strict liability crime. So, is a non-strict liability crime. A strict liability crime is one in which it doesn't matter whether you meant to or not, you still have to pay restitution. So, in the case of the mailbox being run over, that's a strict liability crime. So, it didn't matter if I meant to do it or not. I still have to pay to replace your mailbox because I was the one who broke the mailbox. Okay. Typically speaking, the difference gets played up a lot more in civil courts than in federal courts. However, not to get too newsy, but there was an incident that occurred recently in the United States where the distinction between the two became incredibly important. Just to touch on it a little bit, the whole thing surrounding the Mueller report findings with Donald Trump has to do with, essentially, this person tried to do this, or they had this intention, but did not do it, right? And then there's also the case that they did do this, but what if he didn't mean to, right? And so therein lies the question, is what that person did, is what Donald Trump did a strict liability or a non-liability crime? And we're not going to go into that specific instance because we're not a news channel and I don't want to spend my time keeping up with headlines. But the difference is interesting because when I first started reading into it, I'm going to go ahead and make my assertion for today's discussion, is that initially I am under the opinion that all crimes that are not strict liability crimes are irrelevant, in my opinion. And that's because, and I'll go ahead and lay out a source. Not a source, but like a reasoning. My reasoning for such is that kind of goes back to our video or our episode where we talked about the doctrines of justice, the 5 doctrines of justice, and how I said I favor restitution above all others. So for the same reason, I think that restitution should be the guiding principle on which justice should be dealt with. If there is no harm done, but you had intention to, it shouldn't matter. And it also, as a second point, tends to border too much on trying to prove intent, which is very difficult, and it's a lot more subjective. It's very difficult to be objective when trying to prove intent, much more so than proving what actually happened. For example, there is no DNA evidence you can collect that shows intent. It's all contextual. Like, where did you find the DNA?
To be fair, there's no DNA evidence that you can find that proves who committed, say, a murder. It's all circumstantial.
That is true, but like, usually DNA evidence, for example, is to prove that you were there. Can I put you in at least the place? And if I can do that, I then can limit my pool of people that could have committed the crime to a very narrow place. And then you can use other things to weed out your other suspects, right? When it comes to intent on who would have wanted to do it the most, I understand the value in that when it comes to investigating a crime. Because people who would want to commit a crime are probably more likely to commit the crime. I understand that. And for the sake of trying to narrow a pool of suspects, I can understand it. But when it comes to the whole crime being they wanted to do it, that borders too much for me on maybe, I won't say thought policing, but it kind of is. It's similar to a thought crime.
Similar, but not quite equal. What about crimes like attempted murder? It's not necessarily a crime about intent, although intent weighs heavily into it. Because the crime here is that one did indeed try to murder somebody, not just that they wanted to.
Can we go to a more specific instance?
Okay.
The lightest case I can see is I say I want to murder this person. Is that attempted murder?
No.
Why not?
Because you didn't actually try to murder them, you just expressed intent.
Okay. What if, hear me out, I'm a quadriplegic and I can't get out of bed, but I tried my hardest to get out of that bed to go murder that person. Is it then attempted murder?
Yes.
Okay. So that's your lightest case of
Well, if I'm going by strict definitions here, you attempted to murder somebody, how futile it may have been.
Right.
You tried.
You did try. There's also the implication, there's also a difficulty there where any action can be called into question on whether or not it's attempted murder, because how many steps from the actual murder does it have to be considered attempted? For example, the most extreme case I can think of is I pull a gun out, I go purchase a gun, buy bullets, load the gun, drive to your house. All of this is on video because I'm filming myself do this for some reason. I knock on the door, you open it, I pull the gun out, and I put 4 rounds in your chest and then walk away. Your neighbor walks by, you get taken to the hospital, and you survive. Now, that's probably what most people think when they think attempted murder. Like, if nature was left to do its course, you would have died, and it would have been my fault directly. Now, in that whole chain of events I described leading up to your almost death, it's at which point does it become attempted murder? And for example, if, say, we were to stop that person, how far would I have to let them go before I could stop them from trying to attempt murder and still charge them with attempted murder?
Yep. Yeah, at that point, yeah, it does become trickier to nail that down. Other circumstances matter a lot. For instance, if you had been repeatedly threatening this victim with murder, and then it was known that you had purchased a gun and loaded it and were driving in the direction of that person's house,
right?
Conclusions can be drawn.
Right. Now, say you stop me after I do up to the steps you laid out, okay? You stop me and you say, you're under arrest for attempted murder. Me being me would just not say anything and just be arrested because for a different reason, you're not free till you're in a courtroom. Whatever. So then we go to court, and now you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt
that you were going to that.
That I was going to that person's house to murder them.
Yep. Yeah. I backpedal on that.
Yeah.
That's too soon. I think it would have to be. We'd have to know. Well, we would have to know where you were going. So I think that the point at which you could be stopped is if you pulled up into the parking lot or driveway of the residence of that person. At that point, we know where you were going.
Mm-hmm. So I pull into the parking space at their apartment complex. At that point, you get out of your SWAT van and arrest me for attempted murder. Okay? Me being me, I'll stay quiet. And then my day in court comes. And now you had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I was going to go murder that person.
Well, I have to prove to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that you were going to go murder that person.
Right.
Which is doable.
It's doable, but all I have to do is raise doubt to defend myself. For example, I could say to the effect, I didn't know that person lived there. Then you'd have to go prove that. Okay, so now you prove that I knew where they lived. Then you'd have to prove, like, what if there are 1,000 questions, even at that point, that I could raise, and as long as just one of those questions sticks in the minds of another person, I'll get off for that. And not only that, but I would argue, and of course I understand, I will caveat myself. I understand that human beings cannot have a pure objective anything. There is no such thing as a purely objective system for human beings because we are not purely objective. I understand that. My thought process is we should try to get as close as possible. So, with that being said, that's the system that you've laid out for that. So, what I feel I can do instead is say, okay, that is better than having no justice system. I'll give you that. Like, that's definitely not worse than nothing having occurred. But I think we could do better than that, personally. So let's take I want to kind of move away from the case because I think it's pretty, at this point, all we're going to be able to do is devolve into what-if statements, and it just gets more and more nuanced, the example. And at that point, long story short, there is a spectrum on which each person can subjectively say, this is the point at which you were going to murder that person, and I can, air quotes, prove it, or at least prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, or try to in a court of law. And there might be those who do go to jail for that. Now, under what I'm proposing, in which we only stick to strict liability crimes, up until the moment that bullet enters your body, it's not attempted murder. Because at that point, attempted murder is kind of a moot point.
Well, right. I was going
It's
to say,
either
at
murder
this point,
or assault with a
exactly,
deadly weapon.
Yeah, if we're sticking with strict liability, there is no attempted murder anymore. There is, there's murder and there's assault with a deadly weapon.
And that's what that would be.
Yep.
Right. Now, I think I can see the problems, and I can definitely see where most people will go. It's like, well, that doesn't make me feel comfortable to know that it could come that close before, or I have to get hurt before any crime is done.
Well,
you know.
I guess, yeah, well, the point of contention for me is not necessarily...
and there's the self-defense argument as well.
Well, right. So, if I have a reasonable suspicion that a particular person wants to murder me, then, and they've made threats or whatever, and maybe I know this person and I think that their threat has teeth, then I see them drive up into my driveway and get out of the vehicle with a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
My immediate assumption is it's loaded and they're here to murder me. I should be able to call the police and have them arrest that person, instead of having to make a violent confrontation myself.
Right. So it's at this point where I agree with you, essentially. There's the ideal case, and then there's the pragmatic case. And what I guess I'm really wanting to know is what is more closer to the truth for what actually should be done and what is actually going on in the situation. And that's, I think, where we can take our principles, because ultimately for me, at what point, I don't like setting arbitrary limits for things, and I feel like there is a rule that is more along the reality of the situation. Like, for example, this is not going to be correct, but it's the first thing that jumped in my mind is just an example. But say I'm standing in a room with you and I have a loaded firearm. That shouldn't be a crime. But what if it was just a crime for me to... What if the crime of pointing a firearm and you're essentially flagging someone is just as...
So let me make an addendum to my last statement about I don't want to make the violent confrontation myself.
Right.
Furthermore, if we live in a world of strict liability crimes only, then I can't accuse him of attempting to murder me. Now, suppose I take it upon myself to defend myself preemptively. He has not shot me yet, but I decide to shoot to stop him from being able to shoot me.
Right.
Now, I am the one who committed assault with a deadly weapon, despite the fact that I was the victim.
Right.
Right. That's my contention.
I feel like we have two different contexts going on, though.
Yes.
And I think that's one thing that kind of harkens back to our Doctrines of Justice episode. What we're trying to do is fit a different context of, okay, there are no such thing as non-liability crimes. There are only strict liability crimes, into a system that is built to handle both. Right? So, for example, other concessions would have to be made in order for there to be for there to only be strict liability crimes. For example, like the fundamental system would have to change. For example, what does self-defense look like in that type of system? And
because in most cases of self-defense, you literally do not have the time to wait to see if they were really going to do it. You have to act preemptively, because otherwise you defeated the purpose. Because if you wait until you're already shot to shoot back, even if you do shoot back, you've both lost. You haven't defended yourself.
Right. Okay. So hear me out. Even in the current system, I shoot you in self-defense, right? You can still be charged, and I can still be charged in civil court for the liability of injuring you, right? Why wouldn't I have to pay you restitution for the damages that I did? Because it's very well documented that I did exactly what you said I did. I did shoot you, and I incurred medical bills on yourself. Right?
Yes.
What's to keep in the context of a civil court, the criminal element of a case is irrelevant.
Relevant. Mm-hmm.
So in that case, what's the right thing?
You, in this case, put me in a position in which I either had to do that or die, potentially.
Wait,
So,
which one of us is the assailant in this case?
oh, sorry. I guess I'm the assailant. So
Right.
I put you in a position where you had to shoot me or risk death.
Okay. But I still shot you and incurred restitution. Like, there is a strict liability in there. Fact is, you have medical bills that are my fault. Right?
But I put myself
In the way of my bullets?
Mm,
I know I'm that's kind of a facetious, but
I realize that you can't necessarily argue it this way in court, but I guess in principle what I'm doing is I'm now turning you into a part of the environment.
mm-hmm.
I put myself in a dangerous situation and got hurt. It's not your fault.
Right. Well, I think the point I was actually trying to get to, which is different, is the judge, because there aren't generally juries in civil cases. I don't know if there ever are.
There can be, actually.
Can be? Okay.
And I have heard that in some places you actually do still have your right to a jury in a
Really?
civil case.
That's interesting.
And I don't know if that's across the country or not.
Or on a state-by-state basis, yeah.
I have heard that in at least many places you will not be first given a jury trial, but you can demand one.
Okay. Say it's just a judge, just to make it easy.
Sure.
So the judge seeing this, what really is going on through the mind of that judge, because they're human? Do you deserve getting paid for me shooting you? Or do I deserve to have to pay for shooting you?
No.
Exactly. But what does that mean? Because that's the human terminology. Who deserves to pay? And who deserves to get paid? Especially in strict liability cases like this, where there is a criminal element. You can't fully separate it in the mind of a person. It's who deserves what. There will some who say,
and isn't that really like the
Problem?
principle of justice? Is that like justice is people getting what they deserve?
Right, but the problem with it here is we're talking about restitution.
Yes.
For restitution. Strict liability crimes are the most objective crimes committed.
Yes. Objectively, you shot me, which cost me money.
Right. Which, don't get me wrong, I think in a full scenario, even if you did win that case and I had to pay your medical bills, I could probably get more out of the fact that, well, okay, still though, there's a restitution for you attempting on my life. So that amount's probably going to be greater than I shot you, or at the very least will even out. And I get the benefit of now not having bullets in me, for my time,
Right.
But we still, that doesn't answer anything though. We all still know who deserves it, But why? That's what I want to know. Why do we all just know? And even more importantly, why is it that sometimes we don't all just know? I think that's what I'm trying to get to at the heart of the issue. And to harken back to the whole reason we're having this conversation because I heard about the term strict liability crime like 2 weeks ago. That came about because in the public sphere, at least in the United States, there is a big discussion going on. Well, I say discussion, it's not a whole lot of listening going on, but a whole lot of talking going on about it. Is this person guilty, of what they did, or should something happen? And it's all about, well, did he mean to do it or not? Does he deserve it? And that's what it comes down to. There are a group of people that believes this person deserves every bit of what's coming. And this is the vessel by which to achieve it. And there are others that don't believe that. So it's not so clear. And it's time, and I feel like that's one of the biggest problems right now, especially in tribal groups, or within a superset of a bunch of tribal groups, like a nation full of tribal politic groups or whatever. When we can't all agree on who deserves what, there's a fundamental flaw there in the system. And I feel like what I would like to try to figure out is a way that at least we might even begin having the discussion, how do we fix the system? Or is it possible to create a system that can help, that takes human subjectivity out of it a little bit? And what's the truth? Like, if we look at why people think someone deserves something, right? What is the principled reason on why? That's what I'm trying to get at with liability or strict liability crimes. And I don't know if this is kind of, I feel like the topic's kind of evolved to this one a little bit more. So, and also, I guess, is the reason you deserve something, is the reasons you deserve punishments the same reasons you deserve rewards for something? Or is it logically consistent the same? For example, I believe I deserve to be paid for my work, right? And if I settle up with my employer that, hey, this is what my salary is going to be, we both shake on it. And when I get my paycheck at the end of the month and I see it and it's the amount that I saw, it's not just that I get this, it's that I deserve this, right?
Right.
But is that the same when we see someone who commits a crime and they get punished and we think to ourselves they deserve that?
Well, no, because it wasn't an agreement.
Was it? Wasn't it?
Shall we begin social contract theory now?
I mean, we're only what? Jeez, we're already 46 minutes into this one. That's where it's going to go, though. Well, no. That 46 minutes is including the... Shoot, what time did we start?
The pre-show. Yeah. Weren't you marking time at the beginning of this?
I forgot to write it down. Because I felt like, there's a
I think we're 26 minutes into this.
Yeah, we started like 6:20. Okay, so, I mean, you want to go there? Because we can just go there now.
Sure.
All right, let's just
I
go there.
didn't sign no contract. All right?
I didn't sign no contract.
Let's get that out of
Philosophers.
the way. Philosophers. Yes.
So, David, what is a social contract?
Oh, dear.
How do you define a social contract? To smokescreen me while I look it up on the computer.
Right. So a social contract is a philosophical concept of the agreement that every citizen of some nation agrees to in order to participate in the society. So this includes things like obeying the laws, and this is viewed as an exchange for the benefits of being in the society, such as the government enforcing your rights and, so on and etc.
That's pretty succinct. All right. Formally, a social contract is an actual or hypothetical agreement amongst the members of an organized society or between a community and its ruler that defines and limits the rights and duties of each. Now, that's a word salad of broad terms. So, long story short, this is essentially an Enlightenment idea.
Yes.
It's a very Thomas Hobbesian idea. And for those who want to look it up and go on. But like as David said, it's, we all decide that we're going to get along because it's better for all of us that we get along. But in order to do that, we're going to give up some of the things that we could have done otherwise. Or essentially, you're giving up freedoms for security, in a sense, in that way. And it's called a social contract because normally you don't sign anything and it's not enumerated anywhere because it happens to you when you're born. Well, in a lot of places. Like, for example, in the United States.
Because you're already participating in the society before you're old enough to even understand the concept of what you are, quote-unquote, agreeing to.
Well, when you say participating, I think what you mean to say is you're already benefiting from society.
I guess, yeah, that's normally the angle it comes from, is that you've already benefited from having your rights enforced or from getting any government assistance that, depending on if you're in a welfare state.
Right.
You've already benefited from the system or have driven on public roads, whatever.
Right. Or you benefit by proxy of your parents who benefit. And there's a reason it is you benefited, not you participated, because there's a good argument to be made on, well, how can I participate when I don't know what I'm doing? You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not cooperation at that point. It's chaotic. Well, it's chaotic coincidence instead of logical cooperation or conscious cooperation.
Right. And so my immediate objection to this, and I've used this example, I think, on this show before, of, Joe, I plant a garden in front of your house that you didn't ask for, and then I charge you for it because you benefit from it. Look at all these plants that you have now.
Right.
Your house looks nicer. You can make better salads or whatever.
Even if I think those things.
Yes, even if you think those things.
Right. That wasn't that long ago.
No.
Now, there's also another angle.
You still owe me for that garden, by the way.
Right, okay. I'm not doing it. So we've already covered that ground.
Yes.
There's another angle, though, that we have yet to cover that I think is often more prevalent. Even if it's not addressed directly, it's kind of the theme of the conversation. And that is essentially... It's almost an argument from a selfish point of view. Almost. And the argument from a selfish point of view is you benefit from being in a society. Okay? And because you benefit, it's the logical choice for you to remain in a society anyway. That's what I've heard from some folks, and there's an argument there. And then the second is we cannot afford as a species to go back to non-society like this. And that essentially the benefits of the many outweigh the rights of the few in this case. And so within reason, we are all better off as a species, globally speaking, that we're in structured societies. And because it makes... In the age of nuclear weapons, and humans can now just... humans as the species can just destroy the planet whenever they want to. We can't afford to have this type... that degree of decentralization. And not only that, there's also that hint of, well... The example I've heard, well, another example I've heard, just to give it a third one and make it a nice even prime number, as if the 1 and 2 weren't, but is because I was arguing something about it, like I didn't sign no social contract, and they're like, okay, well you can leave then, and I was like, well I can't because all the land has been taken or whatever, and I was like, so why don't we just give up some land and say, okay, if you want to go do what you want to do, you can just go over there, and they're like, well we can't. I said, why? They're like, because too many people would want to do it. Or, essentially, all the rich people would leave. All of the people who hold the vast majority of wealth would migrate instantly to that place because they're not, in their mind, burdened by having to pay taxes to support those who they've, in their mind, stolen from because they own capital. And essentially, what would happen is you would have a bunch of wealthy people migrating from area to area. Those who are naturally advantaged from birth, continuing their advantage over time. And robbing people blind and then moving on. Insert colonialism argument here and that and the other, right? Those are the three reasons I've heard that we have to. Social contract theory is just a way to explain why we have to do what we do. And it's not, even though, yes, there's an acknowledgement that, yes, you lose freedoms this way. Tough, essentially. It's like, yes, you do lose freedoms, but we can't afford you to have your freedoms as a species and so on and so forth.
I still didn't sign no contract.
Right.
But sure. And often this is put succinctly. It's often phrased, taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized society.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily agree with that either, but normally when someone is arguing about the repayment, so to speak, of society, we're talking about taxes. So,
long story short, I actually feel like this topic ties pretty well into our authority versus power discussion, and so did the people who originally had the discussion on the topic of social contracts. They used the state of nature as their initial conditions, and the state of nature is humans essentially as animals, in our primate form or with zero technology, and we just became magically self-aware out of nowhere. That's the state of nature for human beings. One of the ideas is that the social contract theory was born out of the fact that we are not equal people, and that there will be those, and it's not so much that there are just people who are better than others in general. It's that there are people who are better in environments than others. For example, in an environment where you just got to be bigger and stronger than someone else, like there's no technology around and there's no other evening factors, then the biggest, strongest people are the ones who are going to become powerful. And the only way to not just get destroyed by them, if you are weaker than them, is to submit to them
or join with others against them.
Right, but even then there entails a risk,
Sure.
And but it's that management. And even then, there's also the sense of, okay, I joined with a bunch of others to take out the biggest, strongest person. Okay. Well, there's still a biggest and strongest person. It's just a different person now. So when does it stop? Until that person is not quite as big and strong, or, it's
until
unstable.
that person decides not to wield his bigness and strongness over others.
There's also the condition that the environment has now changed. Now it's not about who's bigger and stronger, it's who's charismatic. So now that person has the most authority and power, realistically. So now you're in a new environment. So now he's the biggest threat to you because he's most charismatic. What do you do? And remember, in this environment, it's not enough that you can just go get other people. Remember, because now the playing field has changed. Now he is powerful because he has the majority of people. So that's no longer an option. So what do you do now? You can revert to nefarious methods, and that's kind of what you could, some would say terroristic methods. You could lie and deceive, but even say it works and then you become the person. Now the environment has changed again. And so each time a new person climbs the ladder, the environment changes. And now what is considered the most powerful person based on their natural talents and skill set natural talents, abilities, and skill set has now just changed to fit the new environment. And it's not so much that the same people would always rise to the top, it's that the certain traits that are selected for will always rise to the top in that environment. It's not to borderline onto social Darwinism here, but it's that's a different thing, because this isn't passed on evolutionarily necessarily, but it's more immediately responsive to the environment, right? So the social contract kind of comes into the point, it was essentially stated as, it comes to a point where people just want, and because each time the leadership changed, regime changes are always terrible for everybody, right? And that's true even in the state of nature. It just sucks for everyone. So after a while of that, people just want stability. Now that we want to be stable, it's like, why don't we all just keep this one person in charge? Because even if he's not the best, it's definitely better than a new person that we don't know, or whatever. Or, it's like for those who say, like, for example, when you say taxes are theft, yes, but is it better theft than getting robbed at gunpoint at a time that you didn't know about? Well, yeah, because at least I can expect this, People will take the same crimes being committed against them as long as they expect it. That's the difference, as opposed to, getting held up and mugged on the street that you weren't expecting that to happen, and that seems worse. Even if the same person happens to maybe just be your landlord and jacks your rent up and gets the same amount out of you, it's like, well, you should expect something like that, That's that. I think that's really the only delineating factor between, an activity that objectively speaking is a crime committed by a matter of authority, and something that is someone who generally isn't given authority, is that you just expect it from them. And the social contract is that expectation. It's like, well, I just understand that that's how this is going to happen. So I submit and am complicit and give authority to that because at least I know what I'm going to get, Now, there were other ideas on the state of nature and how they relate to social contract, but that's, I think, one of the more prominent ones. You had some others that it was essentially to be in the state, the concept of the noble savage, which is essentially, that's how humans were meant to be, and it was all peace and love and wonderful. Humans before society was just a giant hippie commune where we all just did whatever and we was fine. And of course, we can look anthropologically and historically and see that that's definitely not the case. Scope matters, but it's generally not the case. But the social contract, and another thing to keep in mind too, I think, before I end my rant, because I realize I've been talking for quite a minute here. Social contract theory isn't why we do things; it is just an explanation of, I think, what is going on. Why do people do this, and giving it a name? You know what I mean? Like, the people who came up with the concept of a social contract didn't create new systems based on social contracts. It's not that. It's that they were, this is how it seems that people just always tend to organize. What are we going to call this system? And they gave it a name.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, when it's not being wielded as some sort of, pretentious and selfish, accusation against somebody who doesn't want to pay taxes, then, it makes a lot more sense and is a bit more acceptable, because now basically this is just not exactly a science, but a study.
Mm-hmm.
It would need to be a lot more sophisticated for it to be a science. But something like this could be developed into basically a subset of psychology.
Not sociology.
I suppose so.
Yeah. What I think is an interesting anecdote. Have you ever met a single person who likes paying taxes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I actually have.
What is the percentage of people that you've met that actually like paying taxes?
Very, very low.
Right. Now, what does the majority of people say when you ask them about paying taxes? Or what's the general attitude you get?
You got to do it.
Yeah. It's a, shrug, I guess. These same people, if you were to ask them, why do we do what we do? And why is this a law? We'll tell you, because we're in a democracy and that's what most people want. So why is it that most people go, nah, you just gotta. But then on the same coin, the other half of the coin will be like, well,
We just wanna.
And that's what it is, and it's so funny to me that in a it's almost like there's a giant wool over the eyes of the people, and it's like every politician's worst nightmare to just put two and two together in the average mind of the person to wait a minute. And you know what? I feel like we're getting there. It's not with taxes, though. It's with free stuff. This is the first year we have somebody running for president, seriously, who's one of their primary...
I'm not running for president this year.
Well, running for president in this election cycle. Okay, fair enough. Who actually has universal basic income as one of their top items on their platform. The whole concept of universal basic income is you exist, you get money. That is a amazing proposal. And in a democracy, it's just blowing my mind that more people aren't like,
yeah, free money.
Really? Just free money? Yeah. Do you have a birth certificate? Were you born here? Yeah. Okay. Here's your check. And that's really popular. That's getting a lot of steam. And it's funny because the same person, because that's actually a much more interesting proposal to most people who, well, to be frank, don't pay taxes, or they pay a negative tax rate, effectively, a negative effective tax rate because they're below the poverty line, and they get a tax return, even if they didn't pay anything in, they still get credits, whatever. So there we run into a whole other thing where it's like, okay, how does that factor into social contract theory? How does universal basic income work in that case? Like, okay, it's just another way in which you benefit from society. It's like, yeah, but at least social contract theory acknowledges one fact of reality, and that is you have to give something up to get something. There is an exchange that goes on. I would argue an equivalent exchange in a way. Not to get too memey on it, everything has a price, but that's the truth. And social contract theory acknowledges that. We can't all be free, so let's limit freedom, but we can use the freedom we've then given up to buy security or stability, right? And there's an exchange that goes on there. And then in his application, it's, well, we're all going to pay taxes even though we don't like to get things that we do want. So it's almost like an involuntary purchase that you're having to make. But that's the whole point. It's still a purchase. In the case of universal income, it's you don't have to do anything. You get this. But that doesn't make any sense, No one talks about, well, what would we have to give up to universal basic income? You don't.
Well, aside from the inevitable side effects that will happen later, but right now, you don't.
Right now, you don't. And it's funny because the longer we go talking about national debts and stuff like that, man, you remember when that used to be a problem? You remember when everyone wouldn't shut up about the national debt is at $14 trillion? It's going to all crash soon.
We're in the 20s now.
We're in the 20s, and people keep saying crap. But I remember, in 2008, when that was still an issue, and it's so much an issue that people picked who they were going to vote for president. I think it's not that issue yet. Nothing is... You see what I'm saying? Nothing is going on about it. I don't know. I feel like we're getting a little too far into the political space. But
we are.
But still, how can you not when you talk about social contract theory? Man. We're just all over the place today.
Yes, we are.
That's okay. I don't mind. So, what do you think social contract theory gets wrong in its observation of human organization?
Well, it depends on the structure of the society, I think, but
United States of America. There you go.
Okay.
Since that's the structure we know the best.
Okay. People who object. Because the thing that, the principle here is that we agree to do these things to get along. What about people who don't agree to do these things? I didn't sign no contract.
Yeah, but you still pay taxes.
Begrudgingly.
Okay. Social contract theory doesn't care about what you want. It cares about what you're actually doing.
No.
No. But keep in mind, social contract theory is an observation of what goes on, and you can't observe what people think, but you can observe what they actually do. And the whole concept, because go back to the state of nature. I'm sure there were people who are like, man, I don't want to be bullied by this person, but they just did it anyway. That's the observation, is that people will just do things they don't want to do because you just gotta, you know what I mean? In that power structure. That's the whole observation. So you're right. There are people who, well, we just ain't gonna, and those are very few people because they threaten the entirety of the system, including those who are under the whole, you just gotta mindset. They even see those people as a threat. I sent you an interesting newsletter article I got not too long ago. Did you have time to read through it?
I don't think I did.
All right. Long story short, I get a newsletter from a libertarian group of people who are trying to essentially do some proving on the ability for people to live at sea. It's called seasteading. Look it up if you're interested. It's very interesting. Whatever. Long story short, there was a couple, an American man and a what do you call someone from Thailand?
Just Thai.
Okay, yeah, and his Thai wife that built an offshore home 14 miles off the coast of Thailand, right? And they were living out there doing their own thing. They've been living there for 4 months. David, do you know what happened to these two people?
Were they invaded?
Keep in mind, these are your real I ain't gonna people. They were arrested by the Navy and tried with treason for threatening Thai sovereignty. Granted, they weren't there at the time they got raided. They were arrested on the mainland, but their sea home was taken down. Like, they raided everything from it they could and then literally torpedoed the rest of it with military arsenal. Yeah, military weapons were used. And they're both in jail right now facing death. Because life in prison or death. Because that's the crime for treason. Keeping in mind, one of them isn't a Thai citizen. One of them is an American citizen. Well, at least as far as America's concerned, he is. And have you heard anything about this? It seems...
No.
Yeah, it seems kind of weird, that a government is holding an American hostage for treason against a country that's not theirs, But that's what happens. And it wasn't that they violated any, fishing statutes or nothing simple. It went straight to the top. They threatened the sovereignty of the country. And that's treason. That's the highest crime in the land, And therein lies what happens to the people who say, well, we ain't gonna. The system says, oh, yes, you is. That's kind of what happens to those people. And what's even more interesting is that this happens with consent or ignorance. If the average person that participates in this, especially in a democracy, doesn't know about it,
who's going to stop it?
Who's going to stop it? And even if they do know about it, the only way you can make it stop is to say, well, I ain't gonna too. But you just experienced a whole big old reason why you maybe shouldn't say I ain't gonna. And a long story short, you get to the point where essentially we have a name for it when the majority of people say I ain't gonna.
Revolution.
Yeah, that's what happens. Because, well, when enough people say I ain't gonna, we ain't gonna, it stops happening. Because it falls apart. Because no one upholds the contract anymore. And then what happens with almost every revolution?
I knew.
You go back to the state of nature. And out from that, chaotic time comes a brand new government. And that's why the social contract theory is the way it is because you gotta remember at the time these were written, not all of them, But the time, what's interesting is at the time most of these were written, these were right before revolutions swept the world. You know, I mean, I don't know if the French Revolution had occurred yet, but this is before the American. This is right before the American Revolution.
Well, the French Revolution was after the American Revolution.
Which one?
Oh, well.
Because they've had like 4, technically. Long story short, though, all of these colonial possessions revolted, or they peacefully, I will say, revolted, but when you're allowed to revolt, it's not really a revolt, you know? It's just a transition. A lot of places, you know, or they're called a coup when it's just enough, when it's a few powerful enough people to say we ain't gonna, you know, that it's just a coup. But those usually quickly devolve into just the next system. But why is that? Why is it that no revolution ends up in a state where, well, they do all end up in a state, but why is it that no revolutions end up in anything else other than a government, you know?
Well, the old government was bad, so we need a new one. I think goes into it.
Yeah, it's not that government is bad, it's that government was bad.
Right.
And there's also, I feel like, an interesting thought experiment to be had a little bit too is when a revolution takes place, there are people who lead these revolutions, right? Now, how true to the dream of the revolution do you think the new state usually is?
It depends.
On
but,
what?
Well, I think that the immediate result right after the American Revolution was pretty close to what people wanted, at least at the federal level. The states were their own thing. But yeah, in the majority of cases...
Well, which American Revolution? We've had 2. Technically. Actually, we've had a revolution and a coup, technically.
The first one.
So the Confederate States of America, or under the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
That's what I mean. That's not what most people say when they say
okay.
the CSA. But the first United States of America wasn't a United States. It was a Confederation of States.
Yes. Yeah. So, that one.
That one, yeah. And it only took, what, like 8 years before people figured out that ain't gonna work? Or people decided that isn't working?
I was about to say, enough important people decided that ain't gonna work.
Well, not just that, but if I remember my American history correctly, there was a war going on, and there was a problem. Well, you're one of them states that don't have no harbors, and British troops ain't running over your state, so it's like, well, what? Not my problem. You know what I mean? I'm not sending money to help form an army. And
Rhode Island's on the coast, isn't it?
Okay, fair enough.
Rhode Island never plays, okay?
Yeah, never plays.
They never play the game.
Right, but that's the thing is, you know, there were groups of people who were like, hey, I'm not directly affected by this. Not my problem. And that's when the people at the top said, hold on a second. Updating new patch.
1, 2, 3, it is your problem.
Patch 2. Coup applied. Version 2.0 installed. Now it's your problem because I'm going to send... They essentially just did what the British were doing. They're like, okay, well, fine. If you don't, you will have an army on your doorstep. But this time it's going to be my army on your doorstep. And it goes right back. You know, do you think it has a lot to do with the fact that whenever a revolution occurs, the area that is experiencing the revolution is actually still surrounded by other states that are looking maybe to... Because that was the thing about the American Revolution, is that we were under pressure from another nation state to be a certain way, you know, and we had to fight them off first before... Well, it's hard to fight a war as a chaotic conglomeration of just people, you know, against an organized military. And so what did we do? We organized a military, which that kind of takes a supporting structure of a pseudo-government to do. And then when the war is over, it's like, okay, but once the war is over, it's kind of hard to go back to not having all that, you know. I feel like there's a forbidden fruit of power there where
Well, especially over in places where this has sort of been tried, like over in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Where everyone around you is looking at that power vacuum.
like look at all those natural resources you got there. Hi Ukraine. Russia would really like access to that that body of water there in Crimea. Be a shame if we hi Russia, like, and just takes it, It's just interesting. And some would make the argument, and I've actually had the argument made to me before, that that's a good thing. Not the whole, you're Russian now, or this you belong to a country now, but that countries existing are a good thing. And that's where the concept of nationalism comes in, or even internet or globalism, is that having one large body to deal with on behalf of all people is easier to facilitate things like global trade, for example. And this was actually pretty true under the mercantilism system, which is where the whole goal of nationalized economies, because it's essentially what you had, for example, in the United Kingdom, there were such things as private businesses, but they were private businesses that were allowed to exist under a charter from the crown, essentially. So you were allowed to exist as a private business, but that came with some caveats, But the whole goal was, we need to be exporting as much as possible, because if we're exporting things, we're getting money in return, right? So that was the whole goal. Well, it's easy to do that when you're operating on a centralized level. It's a lot harder to coordinate that decentralized, especially in those times, I don't know. But I think that's part of it, is that it's hard for a not government. Well, it's almost very similar to the argument that a communist would make. Yeah, communism works when everyone's communist, And so the only way for them to try it is to force everyone to be communist, and then it would work according to communists, or at least the OG,
And 1, 2, 3 gulags.
1, 2, 3 gulags. But you need them, you see.
Because everyone needs to be communist so that we can be communist.
Well, the whole point of the gulags, David, is to keep people from going to the capitalist pig states. See, if everyone were communist, then the world is their gulag. And then it doesn't matter. The world is my gulag.
It would be a good book. I'd read that.
That'd be a good book, yeah. But there's a point, I think, that's being made there, and that's, these structures that exist are inescapable, in large part due to a human flaw, and that is, in order to escape that structure, you have to have enough power to challenge the structure. But once you have enough power to challenge the pre-existing structure, you are a new version of the same structure, and you have to willingly dissolve, and that's hard. And you see that, people talked about when the world switched to democratic republics by and large. It was actually a big deal when, the peaceful transition from one person to the next in the United States, when George Washington was out and John Adams came in, that was a big deal, because that's not how things had been done before. And that's a huge, and it wasn't just a big deal because everybody wasn't sure that was going to happen. It was a big deal because the majority of the people would have been fine with it not happening. George Washington's approval ratings at the time were insanely high. The dude was a god, a legend to people. Most people would have been perfectly fine with him becoming a king, because that's what they're used to, and they're like, yeah, I like him. Let him be the dictator. He'd be a popular dictator. But then the whole system would have fallen apart. The whole point of all of it would have fallen apart. And then you have to go through another revolution, to get back to the next place, And I feel like with democracies, or at least republics, it's very similar to the way monarchies faced their downfall before. And that was, one of the biggest goals for foreign policy of democracies is to make more democracies, because they like democracies. It's counterintuitive for a democracy to allow for for independent states of just individuals, because those are essentially micro dictatorships, which is kind of what everyone is. You're the dictator of your own life in a way. Except you're not really a dictator because you don't rule anybody else but yourself. But it's counterintuitive for democracies to exist on that level. So the question would be, how many democratic revolutions need to occur before, if, what will there ever be a time when that happens? When a revolution occurs within a democracy, but the system that replaces it is something else, because right now in the world you essentially have dictatorships, which that includes monarchies of any kind, and then you have essentially democracies, which includes republics. People, the big difference is who's in charge. Is it a position of power or is it a person in power? That's pretty much the big difference. Could it be anybody, or does it have to be this person? You know what I mean? Those are the two kinds of societies that people live in. There is no middle ground, really. There are no real middle ground states. There's this huge valley of revolution where once you're in that valley, you could end up on either end real quick, but you don't really know. And it's hard to go from one end. It's hard to go from dictatorships to democracies. It's actually fairly easy to go from a democracy to a dictatorship. And that's happened plenty of times. Nazi Germany is a great example. We put a democracy in place after World War One, and they elected a dictator who stayed a dictator. That's one of the big fears in the United States. Everyone always has about every president who's unpopular is, well, will he, or she, whatever, whether that's rightfully founded or not.
Yep.
So
before we go down into literally Hitler territory,
I could do it in every episode. I mean, it's not that hard.
I know. Should probably call it there. We covered 2 or 3 topics with this. Let's see. What did we even start off talking about? We started talking about strict liability crimes.
And we ended up with dictatorships versus democracies and social contract theory. Yeah. Well, I think, but there was a chain through all of it.
Oh yeah.
Granted, we didn't stick. I think it's because there's not a whole lot of. I think with the whole non-liability crimes thing or strict liability crimes, that essentially was just a retreading with actual terminology, and we realized it about halfway through after about 15 minutes, and then we jumped from there to, what was the middle thing we did? Or is that social contract theory?
Social contract theory.
We went to social contract theory, and we essentially discussed how social contract theory, what it essentially is it's just an observation based on what seems to occur, and then we essentially gave a very brief, very high-level overview of human societies and what social contract theory is. So I think the real lesson we've taken from here is everything is social contract theory, essentially. In modern politics,
everything political.
Everything political revolves around social contract theory. And it itself is just an observation, which is just an open interpretation of what seems to just happen, which is interesting. Why do politics be this way? Because politics be this way. That's the only reason. There's no real reason for it. There's no objective reason. It's all just observation. That's interesting.
Yep.
Well, yeah. I do want to take a brief moment, and I think we need to set up a more structured topic for next week.
Probably.
Because as much as I enjoy just talking, I know this is going to be a tough one to actually put a name on that can fit in the file size that YouTube will let me put up. So let's go ahead and do that after we jump off here. But I think that's a pretty succinct sum up of what this episode's about. So with that, philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.